I'd like to introduce Divrina here. This is her first time at the Jaipur Lit Fest, but she not the first time in Jaipur. You were a Mayo girls' school alumni.
Yeah, grew up just next door.
It's probably some of your fellow students are here. We're talking about this beautifully produced book, The Perfume Project. It's compact. It's a wealth of information. I learnt so much from reading it. It's Divrina's journey through the sense of India, and I have to say that today in Jaipur, I've been to a session on. It's been a sort of celebration of the senses. I've been to a session on music of the Mughal courts. I just went to a session on forgotten foods. So that's music, food, and now we're talking about perfume. So it was a very good combination. Look, I'm going to start. I think if we're going to start talking about scent and how it works, I just wanted to ask you why. I have an old filing cabinet in Australia where I live. In my office, and I bought it in a junkyard in Delhi decades ago, and it's made out of deodar, Himalayan cedar. And every time I open it, I'm transported back to the foothills of the Himalayas, or the Vale of Kashmir. What sort of process is at work in my brain from the moment I smell that odor? We're not talking perfume in this case, but it's the same principle, I suppose, to evoking that memory I have of that past.
Right. Thank you, John, for that kind introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I think what you're talking about is, Proust mentioned it first in his book, In Search of Lost Time, this Proustian effect, which is how fragrance and scent, basically, any smell can transport you and sort of bring back a memory almost involuntarily, maybe even a memory that you previously could not access. And this is, it's a phenomena that we all know. Like you said, you know it intimately because you experience it. There is science behind it. There's there's research that says you smell something, you have olfactory bulbs in your nose. Those are connected to parts of your brain that, basically the part of your brain that deals with fragrance or scent is the same part of your brain that deals with emotion. And so it's, just the sort of the architectural landscape of the brain is such that you do it together. It's also referred to as the limbic brain or the reptilian brain, sort of the old, which works on instinct. And then they've done all these fascinating studies where they will show you how when you smell something, the parts of your brain that there's so much activity in your brain, there's so many parts of it which will light up, so many more versus when the stimulus is, say, visual, which is unusual because we rely so much more on sight. But they're so intimately linked that that's how it works. It's it's good. I think I'll take that in. I read your book on the plane from Australia to Bombay, and I was and as I drove through the streets of Bombay, it was at night time, and I was trying to I was thinking of the smells that I was experiencing, and the closest thing that came to mind was a sort of the smell I get when I'm trying to cook a curry and I've burnt the black mustard seeds. It's this kind of slightly, it hurts the back of your throat a little bit, but it's still a very Indian smell. But we're going to be talking about nice smells today rather than the not so nice ones. And I'm going to read a little passage that Divrina quotes from Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra. And if there are any parents with young kids here, you don't have to worry about it. It's not one of the racier parts. But it describes the sort of the toilette of
an urbanite, a nagarika in Vatsayan's description, and how he begins his day. And I'm quoting now. Now the householder, having got up in the morning and performed his necessary duties, should clean his teeth, apply a limited quantity of ointments and perfumes to his body, put on some ornaments, and apply collyrium on his eyelids and below his eyes, colour his lips with alaktaka, and look at himself in the glass. Having then eaten betel leaves with other things that give fragrance to the mouth, he should perform his usual business. It's a beautiful passage. Can you tell us something about how perfume, how it comes up in some of these early writings? And how far back can we go? What are the earliest references to perfume, say, in some of these, the Vedas or other writings?
Yeah, and you're right, because I think the earliest mention is in the Rig Veda. And it comes up again and again in many of the texts. There's the Rig Veda. The Ramayana has a lot of references to fragrance, whether it was tribute, whether it's part of daily toilet, whether it's worship. In the ancient texts, for the most part, it was in reference to worship. These were these beautiful natural ingredients, and they were used primarily for worship. Incense was used primarily for worship. But then you go, a little further, you have the Arth Shastra, and that deals more with the treasury and the courts. And so there it talks of fragrance as one of, something that's very important in the treasury, just for its value and its worth. There's some ingredients that I mentioned within the 6 that I've written about that have always had a lot of value, and they've always been rare and beautiful. So sandalwood and agarwood have always, had those connotations. And then you sort of you have entire treatises on olfaction. You have the Gandhsara, which was, really just about fragrance. You have a goddess who was the goddess of fragrance,
really? Who was that?
Shakti. Yeah. And the Kama Sutra mentions perfumery as one of the 64 arts that they where they advise that if you're like a literate and a cultured person of the time, it's something you ought to know, or something you ought to be familiar with. And I think that's also where that passage fits in, that there was a period in Indian history, the classical era, where, according to the history that's there, it was just a very prosperous time in the country. There was wealth created through sort of agriculture and newer farming practices, and then there was so much trade. And so there was this, I've quoted Abraham Irali, who's one of my secondary sources that I've leaned on quite heavily in my research. And he talks about it as, that we tend to think of ancient India in terms of this sort of, in terms of its spirituality and this renunciatory spirituality. And in fact, it was not like that. And there was, an absolute enjoyment of the senses. It was absolutely permitted. It was encouraged even. And, so fragrance fits quite neatly into that.
We're talking about rasa here.
Yeah, the Ayurvedic term. Yeah. And so historically, and then of course, if you can jump to the Mughal era, where you have a lot more mention. I think it's just a lot more documentation as well from the courts. And you have, the memoirs, so you have Babur, you have Akbar, you have Jahangir. So in the memoirs that were either written, by the court historians, or you have, in the case of Akbar, the Ain-e Akbari, which was just dealt with different departments of the court. And one of those departments was the Khushbu Khana. So it was entirely dedicated to fragrance. And, His Highness liked the corridors to be scented with aloes wood, but also, some like really fabulous recipes for cooling the skin or things like that. So I mean, the historical precedent is very much there.
Yeah.
And I think it's just you have to look for it. It's there. You know, they're kind of throwaway mentions. This was something that was important, but maybe not as important as statecraft or politics of the time.
And not as conspicuous as your palace or your jewelry or your costumes, but still very important, yes.
Yeah, still just like a part of life. So it's mentioned, and I think you'll know this from your own research, that you sometimes have to comb through these texts, which can be quite dense, and you'll find what you're looking for in them.
I know. When I was researching Indian magic, I would find references in all the, I think in all the texts that you've mentioned, there would probably be a mention of magic and magic in the court as well. Yeah, And the other thing too, the other parallel, I think, to Indian magic, it was how it spread across. It followed the silk routes, the trade routes, and you have a Pliny in the year 77 of the current era, complaining about Indian saffron and how it was always adulterated. So obviously, these perfumes were making their way to the Mediterranean, I'm supposing to China and all around the region.
They were, and the Silk Route, I think, is the one that's, again, it's documented, and it's an overland route. So there's more to say about it. There's more being written about it. There's a lot of literature around it. And then the one that predates that is the Red Sea trade between ancient India and Egypt. And so they have discovered these ports on the coast of Egypt where they have, they've discovered bits of coconuts. They've discovered, of course, some documentation, peppercorns, pots with peppercorns, and all kinds of things, which, to say that there was this very robust trade on that route, which is the sea route. These ships would go to Ethiopia, to Arabia, and then they would come across to India as well. And then I think Muziris, which is near Kochi, was also this very major port. And but they started this excavation sometime in the late 90s. They found a port called Bernik, and they started excavating over there. And they spoke to one of the professors from a university who was involved in this. And I read this in an article, but I just remember it now. And he said, we tend to assume that globalization is this modern thing that's happened in our time, but when you look at the evidence, and you're talking about, before the BCE era, there's enough evidence to show that there was so much trade and so much movement between continents, between countries, and between cultures. And spice and by extension fragrance was again making itself making its way to Greece, and then of course to Rome, where there was this huge market. And again, you mentioned Pliny the Elder, who was complaining about the adulteration in saffron, complaining also about how much money they were losing every year to India because fragrance was taxed. And so
it was similar with magic. I mean, I came across references to, you could buy books on how to do Indian magic tricks in the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad in the 9th, 10th centuries. So it's a, and of course with perfumes, they're very transportable. I mean, the oils, the essences would be, very, you're not talking about cotton bales, you're talking about small phials, I guess, of these liquids, which would be used as the basis for making various different scents.
I think in ancient times you were talking more about the raw material.
Oh, the raw material?
So they would have been talking about aloes wood and sandalwood. They would have been talking about saffron as a spice, and things like that, which are sort of more easily transportable in tons.
Well, let's talk about some of those, the fragrances that you mention in your book. And the book is really, it's about perfume from the field to the factory, from the extractor to the bottles, from the skin to the nose. So it's the whole journey. And you start with rose. I guess it's probably one of the more conspicuous of the ingredients that would go into making perfume. I mean, every time you go to an Indian wedding or there's a temple ritual happening,
when you think of traditional fragrance in India. And I mean, I've chosen 6 ingredients, and you might say that, you know, that's a very limited number, but I chose them because I think I wanted to write about ingredients that were easily relatable to everybody, that everybody had possibly a story to, you know, to tell around it, a memory around it. But also, you know, it goes back to the research. If I was picking ingredients, you know, like they said in the introduction, we grow something like 18,000 ingredients in India, and we export many things, which is, so it's not to say that we only have these 6, but that I wanted to be able to contextualize historically the ingredients that I was writing about, and to place them geographically as well. And that's how these 6 came about. And then I began with rose as just kind of the most obvious, the closest, the distance that I had to travel to begin with.
Which was Kannauj.
Which was Kannauj and UP.
And UP.
So, Kannauj is where it's distilled, and they don't grow over there, but, you know, around it is where they grow. So that's where I went first.
Yeah. I was really struck, I think, in all the ingredients, all the plants that you mention, and we are talking plants here mostly. I mean, you do mention ambergris, which is the like the reflux of the whale,
of the sperm whale
that would float to the surface of the ocean and sometimes come ashore, where a lucky fisherman or beach goer would find it, and a kilogram is worth, you know, thousands of dollars. But even like rose oil, as you say, I think it's rose essential oil, or rue. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah. So rue would be, yes, an essential oil.
10,000 lakh a kilo.
10,000 for, and they don't even, I mean, and these are older prices, so it goes up every year, and every time you ask, it's more. It's more and more, and it's pretty fantastic.
That's incredible. You know, let's talk about sandalwood, because it's one that, you know, I guess springs to mind most often. Incense, it's the sandalwood paste that holy men, women put on their foreheads and so on. It's used to cool the body as well. But my I think first and only encounter with sandalwood, except when I bought a bar of Mysore sandalwood soap, was actually in Australia, believe it or not. I wrote, my first book was on Mukram Jar, the last Nizam of Hyderabad, who famously bought a 500,000-acre sheep station in a very remote part of Australia. It was a big mistake, because he blew the largest fortune in the world in the process of trying to run it. But as I was driving around this 500,000-acre expanse of basically wasteland, somebody pointed out an Australian sandalwood tree. So they are, what's the word? Not indigenous to Australia. They are. They are. I mean, is indigenous the right term? But yes, they grow in Australia, and I think there's actually it's been grown as a commercial crop as well. I'm not quite sure how close it is to the Indian sandalwood. If it's identical, it's probably a subspecies.
It's not identical.
No, it's not identical, but still.
But it's a different species. But, you know, you say you were surprised, but actually, in terms of trade, Australia has, so Indian sandalwood, South Indian Mysore sandalwood has this immense status historically, and sort of among perfumers as well. It's the particular species, Santalum album, but then that Santalum album grown in the particular conditions that you would find on the Western Ghats, where the forests would naturally occur. just smells incredible. So
Yeah.
it has this huge status.
Yeah.
But in terms of, but it, and I've written about this. It's pretty much been wiped out between poaching and between the
Yeah.
government and between their sort of policies that have been.
Everybody here has heard of Veerapan, I guess. The famous sandalwood poacher, the outlaw who was finally killed in an encounter.
That statistic really blew my mind because
10,000
tons
of sandalwood was poached.
Is what he managed to poach and just
Incredible.
Decimated forests completely. Illegal trade and all of that. And so Australia is where they began growing it. Both the Santalum album, which is the species that grows, which is native to India, as well as the other species that's native to Australia.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they just, they cottoned on pretty quick. And because it takes a minimum of 15, maybe 20 years till you can harvest the tree in order for it for the oil to have any value. And so all the oil really comes from Australia now. All the wood comes from Australia.
And pure sandalwood oil is worth more than gold. So a kilo of pure sandalwood oil is worth more than a kilo of gold. I think you mentioned.
Yeah, it is.
It's incredible.
I think you'd find that with
no wonder
most of these ingredients are just worth more than gold and rarer, harder to
extract.
Get in those quantities.
Yeah. It is a sad story. I mean, as you say, a valuable commodity like this, you're going to get people going into the forests and trying to cut down trees. I mean, you visit the sandalwood. Is it the institute in Mysore where they grow sandalwood in there, and even there, poachers try and get in.
It's the Institute of Wood Sciences in Bangalore.
Yeah,
and
in Bangalore. Sorry,
it's this. It's this amazing 25 acres in the city. But and when I met the director over there, he had these fantastic stories. He had, they had sort of all this action in the middle of the night because poachers had come and the poachers had guns, and then he had to wake up, and then there was the police and there was all of that. But they had a few large trees on the campus that did get poached. They had sort of grafted tissue from these old valuable trees, and they had all these plantations, 20, 30 trees that they had great hopes for, and those were entire field stations that just got wiped out and poached. And in Mysore is the Karnataka soaps and detergents factory.
Which is a lovely story because it was set up by Krishna Raja Wadia in 1912, I think.
Yeah.
And if you go there, they still use the original vats.
They still use the original vats.
Yeah.
They just have, their production has diminished to, I think, less than a fourth of what it used to be even a decade ago. But when you mentioned the soap, it has its own GI tag now, that soap and that factory, and they still use the oil. So it is actually like a pretty reliable way to get to
it. Yeah.
Mysore sandalwood.
Yeah. The other ubiquitous, I guess, plant is jasmine, and I think you're right that there's a popular saying in the fine fragrance industry that there is no perfume without jasmine. It makes its way into every fine fragrance, whether a classic floral one or one that is more modern. Jasmine is always needed. Yeah.
That's true for the most part. You do end up using it. Whether it would be a natural extract or not and that's a different debate altogether, that between naturals and synthetics. I have not touched upon it, but it comes up a lot.
Yeah.
But jasmine is, I think, at this point, I think it's like our best known export because it's, again, it's the quality of the jasmine, the Sambak jasmine, which grows in Madurai, and it's called Madurai Malli in Tamil, and it is being exported to a lot of the big fragrance houses in France. So I write about Grasse, which is where I went to study, and they grow jasmine as well. It's really famous, but for the most part, a lot of perfumers come to India and they go to South India to source their jasmine.
Yeah, you have a lovely description of going to the Meenakshi temple in Madurai and seeing in the flower market there and seeing the flowers going in the early morning. It's lovely. The other one that you've got a chapter on saffron. I mean, we did mention Pliny the Elder complaining about saffron being adulterated. Now, saffron, I associate saffron with something that you cook with rather than a fragrance. But so tell us a little bit more about saffron. And there's also there's a sort of a darker side to that story, or not so much, or darker, or less, the struggle that farmers in Kashmir are having to grow the product and the.
So you're right. I mean, it is, and within Kashmir as well, it's consumed as a spice. So they're growing it over there, but they don't distill it. That again goes to Kannauj for distillation. And I think saffron, zafran, attar is really a very Indian thing. Because when you have the use of saffron in fine fragrance elsewhere in the world, in Europe, they use synthetics and isolated molecules. They don't use the oil that's distilled. When you go to Kashmir, it's this entire experience. It was one of my most, I think it was one of those journeys that I took out of the 6 that was really special. I went there with, I think, some kind of expectation in my head that I would see these fields of saffron and of purple, and Google will show you those images, so completely misleading. But you go there and it's not, it's quite sparse, and then when you speak to the growers, you basically come to understand, and of course for each of these ingredients, cultivation and the farming is difficult and it's arduous, it's hard work. Saffron, they have also, it's been particularly sort of denuded by climate change, and every year production has decreased. But the distillation of it and the oil so the saffron goes from Kashmir to Kannauj, and there they have this, they distill it over sandalwood oil, they hydrodistill it, and that is, it's just a really, really special fragrance. It's really velvety, it's got like notes of hay, it's got notes of violet, really very beautiful and very, very Indian. It's not used elsewhere.
Yeah. And also oud. So this is, I wasn't that familiar with it, but it comes from a tree, from the bark of a tree, is that right? And that tree you can find in northeast India and other sort of hilly forested areas around there, and it's a very important ingredient in perfume as well.
Yeah, oud again is one of those ingredients that has become it's hugely famous everywhere. Particularly in fine fragrance and a lot of men's fragrances as well, and it had this resurgence sometime maybe 15 years ago with Tom Ford and all of these big brands, and but in fact, and when I started reading about it, there were 2 things that surprised me. Was that it is absolutely native to the northeast of India, and then again when you go and look at it historically, it's mentioned. So it's mentioned even in the Ramayana. There's this entire passage where Yudhishthir has lost his game of dice, and there are all these. I mean, at the time that they live in that palace, and there's kings that come from everywhere to pay tribute. Some of those people are from the northeast, and part of their tribute is agar wood, aloes wood. And then you find it mentioned again in all the Mughal texts as well. And then you travel to Assam and you find that it's there, it's growing in the it's very common. And I've written in the book how there are plantations, but for the most part you'll go and every family in their backyard will have a tree, maybe 2, because it's so valuable. And then when you can sell it. So if you had a wedding in the family, you have sickness in the family, you need some extra funds, you chop that tree down and sell the wood.
Gosh, okay.
And the other thing that surprised me about oud was that when you smell the oil, it is not one of those smells that would appeal to you immediately. It can be really off-putting when you first come across it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm always surprised, because there was a point when I was working with the perfumery, and we used to have these stalls that we would set up and sell at different fairs and things, places like this. And people would come and ask regularly whether, do you have anything with oud in it? And I was like, why? Why do you want because it can smell so funky, and it smells like blue cheese. And then so I'm always surprised. But oud is massive in terms of the value it's held and the sway it's held historically, how valuable it is.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you've got absolutely beautiful descriptions of these smells, actually. Earthy, grassy. I mean, I'm not going to try and mimic them, but it's really one of the more beautiful parts of reading the book is you can actually kind of imagine the smell from your description of it, which is a hard thing to actually do as a writer, to bring to get your reader to imagine what the scent that you are describing.
And it's one of those things. There's no innate vocabulary to describe smells. You always have to rely on other words that would approximate.
Yeah, it's not like wine, where I think there is a vocabulary that to describe a semi.
Yeah, I mean there are some technical terms, but I think those are technical terms.
Yeah.
So when you work in the field, those would make sense to you. But other than that, you have to build a vocabulary for yourself for everything that you smell. When you work, then you have to do it in order to be able to have that recall when you next smell this. But I think it's something that people do quite naturally as well. Yeah. You just maybe don't pay as much attention to it, but there's some smells that you just know, and you know what they smell like, and you've assigned words to it. Yeah. And when I wrote, I did try consciously to try and evoke as much as I could so that it would make its way to the reader.
Yeah. Just finally, before we open up to questions from the audience, I guess it's the obvious one. What about synthetic perfumes? Are they? Do you have to be an expert to tell the difference between something that's been produced in a laboratory and something that's been produced by hand? That's started its journey in these semi-barren fields of Kashmir, where it's painstakingly picked by hand. And as you say, makes its way to Kanauj and then eventually to bottles. I mean, are our chemical laboratories up to mimicking these scents? And if they're as good as maybe they pretend to be, does this mean that we're going to see the end of traditional perfumery at some point?
I'm going to address the first part first, which is a very short answer, and it's yes, they are that good. And in the hands of a good perfumer, you can't really tell if it's a composition. You can't tell within a composition how much of it is natural and how much of it is synthetic. And quite often in blind tests, when you give people a reconstitution, say, of a rose, and you give them rose essential oil that's hydrodistilled, they will pick the reconstitution because they feel it smells more natural. So, but apart from that, like this sort of dichotomy between natural and synthetic, I think is a created one. You do need both, and they're both important. I don't think you'll have the end of traditional perfumery or natural fragrances, although they are becoming rarer and sort of less sustainable, just in the way that any farming practice where you have a monoculture and you need acres and acres to grow any one thing, in the way that any of those are less sustainable, it's becoming harder, they're becoming more expensive. because they're becoming more expensive, the demand is huge, and so I don't think they're going to really go anywhere. But synthetics is really where a lot of the work is happening. The new molecules, new fragrances, and how they're used by perfumers who really would, I think, say that they treat the whole thing as one palette that they can work with. And if you take those away, then you suddenly have less than half of the things to work with and to create with.
Okay, thank you. Let's open it up to the audience for questions. I can see about half a dozen hands going up, and we've got about 15 minutes. So why don't we start at the back? There's a gentleman there, and then we'll sort of make our way forward.
Hello. Okay. So we talked about these 6 elemental fragrances, right? What I want to understand is that how much of a universal appeal do these have to us as humans versus how much of it is cultural or marketing driven?
I think it's all cultural, and so that the appeal that it has to us in India, because I'm talking about 6 Indian fragrances, is, because culturally it goes back such a long way that you have associations with it, and so it is all cultural in that case. Whether it's, I would not say it's innate. There's very little of that. You form associations when you smell something, and until the time that you've smelt it and in the environment that you smelt it, it has no meaning to you. So I would say it's all cultural, and but marketing definitely plays a role. And again, I would say something like oud, I think was like a marvel of marketing, because when like I said, when you smell it in its raw form, you probably will not like it. So.
Okay. There's a gentleman here with the hat on. I think I know, I can see you in the back row, sir. This man did come in first, so we'll get to you.
Hi. I just wanted to know whether there is any reference, whether you have found any reference in your research on scents or perfumes used as medicine in India.
Thank you. Yeah, I have. When you read Ayurvedic texts, the line between what is used for just beauty and what is medicinal is kind of a blurred line, and so you will find references that say, for example, the fragrance of vetiver was used to ward off senility. They may not be accurate, but they're very much there, and there was the entire concept also in Ayurveda, but also in Unani traditional medicine, where they just, because these were beautiful smells, then they were also conferred with these health-giving properties. So it was good for you to smell these.
Let's go to the lady there in the aisle, just here.
Hello, I'm from Lucknow, and there's this amazing perfumer there called Sugandh, which makes very traditional smelling perfumes. I've been a big fan of theirs, but I also am a big fan of fine fragrances, European fragrances. I just wanted to know if exists a vocabulary out there that can help describe the difference in the way, like say, an Indian perfume presents itself versus the way a European perfume presents itself. Like I don't know. I don't have the vocabulary to describe it. I'm asking for help.
Do you mean vocabulary to describe how it smells, or?
Like there seems to be there's a heavier kind of a presentation of Indian perfumes versus a lighter note or whatever that comes through with the European ones. I'm just wondering.
I think partly what you're referring to would be a difference in formulation. When you go to Sugandh and you're smelling what they make, they work with naturals, and these are, for the most part, they're very powerful smells, and they're maybe not diluted. And when you're talking about something you bought off the shelf, a European fine fragrance, the difference would be in the formulation, in the ingredients, and the dilution. And then, of course, you do bring in marketing, and then, that changes, I think, how you would look at each of these. I do say sometimes that I think traditional Indian fragrance has a marketing problem more than anything else.
One last question. Is there anything that exists in between these two? in currently in terms of
There are a number of brands that are working exactly to bridge that. And so I think, yes, there are now options that exist that are trying to do exactly what it is you're saying, bridge these two things.
Okay. Well, let's this gentleman in the back row has had his hand up every time. We'll go there. I think we've got time to get around to everybody. So,
Yeah, hi. And I'll make it quick, and thank you for a lovely session. I was in Uttarakhand. It's nice and cool, much cooler than here. And I just came across this, and I was wondering, there's a very nice smelling sap that came from a pine tree. It wasn't the cheer, it probably was a fir, and a very nice apple notes to it. The question is, have you come across any research? Fragrances being made from pine sap or tree saps?
No, not in my research, but no, so not in historical research. Although perhaps it's there and I just didn't find it, so I would not rule that out. But pine is distilled, and in the lab certainly you have it, but it does not smell like the sap that you're describing. Pine has a very disinfectant, sort of astringent smell.
That's the turpentine one. This one was
Yes.
very apple and. With
I'm
apple
not
notes.
familiar with it. Sorry.
Thank you.
okay, we've got a gentleman in the beige shirt here, about 3 rows from the front. And I'll go to you, sir, after that.
Hi, thank you for a beautiful book. I'm Devansh. I'm actually from a family that's had an intergenerational perfume business in Kannauj. So it's great that you're telling this story.
Thank you.
What I want to ask you about is, I've always found it funny that more of my friends will recognize Chanel No. 5 than Rue Gulab, or you talked about Tom Ford's Oud. So I'm curious for your thoughts on the marketing of traditional Indian perfume and what we can do to preserve this craft, which from a business perspective is kind of dying out and people are moving into other industries.
This goes back to what I said, which is that I do think traditional fragrances have a marketing problem. You are much more likely to recognize Chanel No. 5 because you encounter Chanel No. 5 really often and you read about it a lot, and it's been built up to the status that it has. And maybe a Rue Gulab or another Zafran has never had that. This is also because, and you would know this, you're from a family in Kannauj. Traditionally, the business has not been of selling to consumers, but to other businesses. And so that's only changing now very slowly, and the smaller brands. And so hopefully, I'm not the person perhaps to tell you about the business side of it, but I can tell you about the research side of it. But I think that is changing now, and hopefully it will.
Okay, this gentleman in the front row has been very keen to ask a question.
I have 2 questions, one for each.
Can you speak a little bit louder? Put the microphone closer to you.
I have 2 questions, one for each of you. One is, ma'am, what is your favorite perfume and why?
This is a really tough question.
Yeah.
I don't think I have one favorite. I tend to switch them a lot.
Okay. Top 3.
I'm gonna let John go first with the other question.
Sir, as the author of The Last Nizam, what is your take on the happenings after the Nizam dying the other day?
Oh, it's a bit like an episode from The Crown, isn't it? A Netflix drama. Yes. Mukram Jar died almost exactly a year ago. It's just slightly over, and his son Azmat Jar is now the 9th Nizam.
Yeah.
But there are pretenders to the throne, of course.
And coronations and all of that.
Yes. It's a bit of a tamasha. That's all I can say. But we're really here to talk about the perfume. I'm happy to chat with you about the Nizam later. But Divrina, that was going to be my last question to you. So this gentleman has.
I would say I would pick vetiver. So khas would be one, and then I'm going to go with that very reliable answer of my mother's perfume, because it makes its way into the book, and it's not something I wear, but it's just a smell that I relate to a lot and I'm very close to.
We've got time for one more. Oh gosh, we've had which one? Yeah, the lady over there, because we haven't had many ladies asking the questions. So, if it's quick, we might have time for one more.
Thank you. So I think I have a question that relates to a couple that have already been asked. So like you said, Indian perfumes do have a marketing problem. But the idea that European perfumery does a lot of complex work, so mixes a lot of ingredients, and I think I've only come across one or two brands like Sugandh Co, like she mentioned, which mix different perfumes. Otherwise, we find like a sole ingredient, and that's prioritized. So is that something to do with natural versus synthetic, that naturals don't blend that well or at a large scale, or is that only a business issue that it just hasn't been done, or the marketing isn't there, or the money isn't there being funded into that industry? Naturals do mix well, it just hasn't happened yet.
No, I think what you're saying, I mean, the traditional fragrances were made in the way that they were made. So they were single ingredients in the case of a roux, and if it was an attar, it was that single ingredient that was distilled over sandalwood, and there you had two, and you
One more, the lady in the aisle there, and then we'll have to call it a day.
A slightly different question. Now, Indian food has a lot of fragrance. Like you can smell a batate vada and you have to eat it. So what do you feel about the fragrance of Indian food? I know it's slightly different question, but something like biryani or the saffron rice, you have to have it once you smell it. And what makes Indian food so fragrant and so potent and so strong?
I'm going to try and answer that, but I spend next to no time in the kitchen, so I'm possibly not going to be correct. Why it smells so potent in some cases would be the spices that go into it, which many of which make their way in a distilled form into fragrance. Why you like it so much would go back to the theory of, I think, what we call odor associative learning, which is that you encountered these foods at a time, and you have very positive associations with them, and now you really enjoy them.